Level check. This is a recording. The number you have reached is not in service at this moment. Please be sure you are calling the right number and are dialing correctly.
I guess we just leave that going. Bill Audio 2.
Hello. No, whether you have one button on the mouse or two buttons or three is a totally separate thing from how the menu system works.
Okay.
And what our experience there in testing, so we prepared mice that had 1, 2, and 3 buttons on them. And whether you physically label it on the button or not, mentally there has to be a name for each button. There's a concept. So like, for example, select and what's the second one? Extend or alternate or something, right? Option or something. What we found is when we had more than one button on the mouse, people spent a fair amount of time looking at the mouse. They were afraid their finger was on the wrong button. And when we went to one button, they stopped looking at the mouse. They just looked at the screen. We also thought that one button was a good idea because if you used a touch screen, it's going to be one finger. If you used a stylus on a tablet, it's going to be one point of contact. So if we could do it with one button, then it would be better. That did, however, force us, like for opening up an icon versus selecting an icon, it forces us into the double click. And double click is kind of problematic because you have to be able to click quickly between several different things. Click there and there and there. Well, so those are all a short time apart, but they're spatially distinct. And you have to be able so the double click parameters really are sort of how much time between clicks and how much distance between clicks. And any one set of parameters is going to be right for somebody and wrong for somebody else. So particularly beginners kind of like stab at the mouse with their finger, then they wiggle the mouse while they're doing it. And that wiggling creates a spatial distinction that then it doesn't get registered as a double click. So the double click was sort of, it worked, but it wasn't a perfect solution. We tried, we just tried different things, and the biggest reason for the single button on the mouse was so they'd stop looking at the mouse and they'd look at the screen. And once we did that, then it seemed to work better that way. The initial Lisa hardware, we were afraid that smooth scrolling wouldn't be fast enough, and so they made a hardware architecture where this line of pixels is pointed to in memory by a pointer, and then this next one will be pointed to a different pointer. And if you wanted to move all of these lines up, all you have to do is move the pointers, and the hardware would read them out from a different location. So you get a smooth scroll like that. There's a little problem with that. That doesn't work when you have windows, because you never want to scroll the whole screen. You want to scroll the contents of a window. So those were never used. That hardware feature was put in and paid for, but never ever used because we went to overlapping windows that were, we wanted to scroll a window's worth instead of the whole screen width, right? There were other things in the Lisa hardware that were kind of slow. The disk access was really slow, well, another thing is we thought that for text, it's sort of more important to have distinctions horizontally. If you're trying to get away with a limited amount of memory, we thought it would be better to make each pixel sort of taller. They were half again taller than they were wide. But that was a problem, and really we should have just thrown more memory at it and have the pixels be square. The initial Lisa, the hardware had pixels that were half again as tall as they were wide. So if you took a font that somebody had designed for some other computer or some other purpose, you had to kind of distort the font or it was going to come out just too tall. Or even things like drawing a circle. We had to draw ellipses because in order to get something to look like a circle, we'd actually mathematically be drawing something that was 2/3 as tall as it was wide, because it would draw, distorted like that. So the Macintosh started out with a 6809 processor, which was cheaper than the 68000, but not as powerful and not as big an address space, and wouldn't have been able to run QuickDraw. And there was sort of a fight over that, and Burrell Smith was a genius hardware engineer who did the digital board for the Macintosh, and he figured out a trick. Well, we didn't want to have to put in 16 RAM chips, but he found he figured out a way to rapidly access 8 RAM chips, sort of put one row address strobe out and then 2 column address strobes, and quickly suck in 2 bytes in it almost the same time as it would have taken to do 16. So this, we called it a bus multiplier or something like that, allowed him to use only 8 RAM chips but have 16-bit path, data path, and then he could use the 68000 processor. Now the processor was more expensive, but at least we wouldn't double up the RAM and have to have twice as many RAM chips in the thing. Later, we put more RAM in it anyway, so it wouldn't, we could just put 16 wide. That wasn't a problem. The original Macintosh had 128 kbytes of memory. That's 1/8 of a megabyte of total RAM. And Burrell Smith, a genius hardware designer, could see that RAM chips were going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper. And so the chips that he was using had a certain capacity, and there was another one coming out that was 4 times as much that could fit in the same sockets, but needed something a little bit different on the circuit. And so he designed it so that you could use either chip if you cut a trace. And Steve Jobs was adamant against that. He thought, that'll make it fat like Lisa. There's sort of like this, I don't know, ego shit going on here, but we don't want Macintosh software to be fat like Lisa. We want all the apps to be skinny and tight and fit in this 128. This is maybe little bit vestiges of Jeff's information appliance one size fits all thing. We don't want to have different sizes of Macs. We want only one size, and all the apps have to squeeze into there. And so Burrell, against Steve's direct orders, made it so that the original motherboard for the Mac, in manufacturing, they could cut one trace and it would take the big chips. So that's when later the Fat Mac came out. We called it the Fat Mac because it had 512 kbytes of memory, 1/2 of a megabyte instead of 1/8 of a megabyte.
It's funny you called it that. It was called that considering Steve
Fat
Jobs.
Mac.
Steve Jobs going, I don't want it to be fat.
Yeah, yeah. So Burrell saved the day by going against Steve's direct order. Another way that people went against Steve's order, Steve did not want Macintosh to have any kind of fan. Now, the original design was our chimney design that could vent, but it also didn't have slots for putting I/O cards and other graphics cards, other extensions in it. When you went to the Mac 2 that had to have card slots in it, you had to allow for a power-hungry graphics card. So there had to be a way to vent the heat from that. And so there had to be some way to move the air. So that the Mac 2 had, in its bill of materials, had a CED, which stands for Convection Enhancement Device. It's a fan, but a slow-moving plastic fan that doesn't make any noise. And so it got past Steve. But if Steve didn't know that there was a fan in it. It was just a CED, and because it was kind of box shaped instead of tower shaped, it wouldn't just vent by convection, and even if it were tower shaped, it wouldn't vent enough to do a powerful graphics card. If you wanted to add card slots where people could add functionality, you had to have a fan, and to get around Steve, you had to call it a CED. When I was working on the Lisa user interface with the pull-down menus, I went to visit Doug Engelbart at SRI, and he had developed the Augment system for knowledge workers. And it was a little bit complicated, and maybe took some number of years to learn how to use it well, but it gave them some power. And one piece of advice that he gave me, he said, as you're trying to make something user-friendly, that a novice can walk up and figure out how to use it, be careful not to lock out the power user from eventual power and speed. He said, think how difficult it is to learn to ride a bicycle. But it's worth the investment because it gives you some power, right? If you were to say only user-friendly devices, the bicycle might be excluded. So that night I went home, I thought about it, and I added command keys to the pull-down menus. They didn't have them before, but I made it so there was a little Apple symbol and a letter, and that means if you press the Apple key on the keyboard and type that letter, it would be the same thing as choosing that pull-down menu. So cut, paste, copy, undo were kind of the ones closest to your left thumb. I mean, you would do command and one of those, and you could speed things up. And this was the direct result of Doug Engelbart's advice of don't slow down the power user. And it was a very, very simple thing to do. And they sort of were self-teaching, because when you did choose it from the menu, you saw those letters over there. And every time you saw those letters, it was kind of giving you a hint, by the way, you can get here quicker if you use the command keys. So command keys were added on after Doug Engelbart's inspiration. The Lisa had a key with an apple on it that was the command key. And on the Mac, Steve didn't really like that. He said that's kind of abusing the Apple logo. And he wanted to find a different way of representing that. So he gave the job to Susan Kerr. And she studied iconography and looked up different symbols, and she found this little freeway interchange symbol that we have now. And that was, she found it on a Finnish map, and it represented a feature, an outstanding feature like a campground or a zoo or a park or something like that would be a feature. So we called it the feature key. And the Mac had this little cloverleaf thing on instead of an apple on it. And so the next run of the Lisa had to have, they put an apple and the feature key, and people would be a little confused. Why has it got two things on it? And which one do I get when I, and people never really quite got that meant command. That doesn't speak the words command, but that was the command key. And feature, that didn't carry, because it's like you're telling me, do this for me. Mm-hmm. Right? But that's where that discrepancy came between the Lisa and the Mac, and then the Lisa kind of had to adapt and have both on the key. What I have here is a binder of Polaroids that I took from my Lisa prototype. There were only a few prototypes. I had one at my home at the time I lived in Santa Clara, and I would work on user interface issues. I'd take a Polaroid picture and I'd get on my motorcycle and I'd drive out to Apple and show people there. And so there was this kind of back and forth about the user interface. And I ended up with a bunch of Polaroids kind of documenting the piece by piece evolution of the Lisa user interface. This one shows the first characters on a Lisa display, and they are proportional width. That is, so we were used to on the Apple II, characters, an I character and a W character were the same width, and it was kind of lumpy. But now we could have, because we have a full bitmap display, this is a font that I handmade and put the characters on there. I wrote the stuff that would put that there. The Lisa user interface used to be, it started out being a black background and with white characters on it, or white lines and things like that on it. Later we switched to a white background. Here's
and this is bitmapped as well at that time.
All of this is bitmap. So this display is bitmap. The prototype was being driven from an Apple II with a card in it that would talk to this prototype display. And so here's our first user interface. Had 25 by 80 characters with it had a scanline pointer so it could scroll it in hardware, and then it had 720 pixels wide, and we had soft keys at the bottom. Now what soft keys were, they kind of came from HP had a terminal where there was underneath the CRT of the terminal, there were some unlabeled keys. And they would, at the bottom of the display, they'd put up labels that would sort of go with those keys. And so we tried that, and there were 10 labels here, and they would go along with 10 keys on the keyboard. And the problem we found with this is that 10 things is not enough to do anything, do a real app. You need lots more than that. And so there would be kind of a hierarchy of commands, and when you touch one, it would relabel all the keys. Well, that became pretty error prone because people, to work quickly, would learn a sort of sequence of tap, tap, tap. But they might be saying delete, yes, confirm, yes, I really confirm. And then, they were screwed. We found the soft keys were not a really good idea. And we didn't stay with them very long. So here I redid the line drawing algorithms to be much faster. I worked out a polygon fill routine so that we could make things like filled, in this case, pie chart things. I did three-dimensional graphics things, so mapping 3D coordinates into a 2D and drawing shaded things. So here was kind of our first stab at icons. So we had a little confusion in our own minds about the difference between a folder and a document. Today, we think of a folder as a container that contains other documents, but at that time, documents had little tabs that looked like folders on them. And so there's kind of confusion about a folder versus a document. So this is a document with a name on it, but it looks like a little tab. And we made it so that you would double click this and it would shrink down into just the name on the desktop. So it's sort of a little icon that's the name tag. And you double click this and it would open up to the window. You double click the title and it would go back. So this was sort of our first icons on the desktop, is just the little name tags, and they would open and close. We had menus that were across the top of each window, and these were actually the titles of these are menu items. But then the title here, you would double click this, or you press on this, and give it a choice of new titles, and you could choose which title. One of the problems with this menu system was that if the window wasn't wide enough, then you didn't get all of them. And if the window was down near the bottom, you didn't get all the choices. So this was kind of a problem. The first time we moved the menus up to the top of the screen, that's the pull-down menus, that was a real big boost, because suddenly you had the whole width you could count on and the whole height you can count on. Now, some of the guys on the team said, oh, well, this is a problem because you're working down here on the screen and now you got to reach way up there to get to a command. And you'll have to reach further and it'll be too hard. And so one of the things we did at that point is introduce mouse scaling. Instead of having a certain number of millimeters on the table matched to a certain number of millimeters on the screen, and that be a fixed ratio, we made that velocity dependent. If you moved quickly, it would go into high gear and move more on the screen than you would think. And people said, oh, well, that's terrible because that'll make the mouse eventually get out of sync and it'll fall off the table. And we also, I think at the time we had it so that if you went off the top, it wrapped around to the bottom, which was pretty darn geeky. And we stopped doing that. And that made it, when we stopped doing that, it would pin at the top. That meant the top was actually very easy to get to because you did a little quick jerk and it would get to the top and stop and not overshoot. And we learned to every so often pick up the mouse and reposition it if it was getting too close to the edge of the table. So this was the first time we did the menus at the top, the pull-down menus. Also, we had a problem with scroll bars. Not every application wanted to use horizontal scrolling. Most of them wanted to use some kind of vertical scrolling, but they didn't all want to use horizontal scrolling. But we had in the corner here is the grow icon, and you would press in that and get a little flickering rectangle, stretch it out to the shape of the window that you wanted as it was flickering, and when you let go, the window would jump to match that. Okay, but the problem with that is beginners would kind of stab at that and basically click in it, drag just a little bit and let go, and the window would go down to a teeny little window like that. And they were sure they'd broken it. Looks like turning off a television. It all collapses, right? And so we realized this was a problem, having the grow icon up there. So we shifted to requiring both scroll bars. You could gray out one if you didn't want to allow horizontal scrolling, but it allowed us to put the grow icon in the corner. Now a little movement would make a little change. It wouldn't suddenly thunk down to nothing. So the grow icon became in the corner, and that made us also have to use the both scroll bars. You can see now the little tabs are sort of more shaped like folder tabs instead of just rectangles they were here. And we put them, instead of kind of in a row here, we put them across the bottom so it looked a little like a filing cabinet. And you could double click on one of these and it would go back to its place in the filing cabinet, or double click on one of these and it would open up into there.
That's a cool idea. Sort of like
well, we were still confused about folders versus documents too,
yeah.
Right? These were documents actually, but they had folder tabs on them, and that was part of our own misunderstanding. Okay, oops, what do we got here?
All right, so I'm gonna adjust it up. Let's see. All right.
Okay, let me.
Already still need to.
Yeah, I flipped to too many. Okay.
Okay, so that's good. That's in there.
Okay, so this was the initial Lisa user interface with black background and the soft keys. We started playing with Windows. This is the very first Windows on Lisa. This was not a window manager. It's just some one-off code that I wrote to draw some overlapping windows. What does it look like? Because we were still using the full width and the hardware scrolling due to pointers. But when you start wanting to put things in Windows, you can't use that anymore. Here is Windows and a pop-up menu like we'd seen in the Xerox documents. So a pop-up menu would just have, a handful of items in it and didn't have really enough choice to run a real application with. We didn't, at that point, have our pull-down menus. We went through an area. One of the questions is, how do you move text around? And we initially had a system called Thing and Place, where you select a range of text. Here's the thing. And you click over somewhere else, that's the place, and you say, move to there, right? The thing moves to the place. But what we found in user testing is people don't get it. It was too complicated. People feel physically like they're someplace in a document. They imagine a big document that they're walking around in, and they can only be in one place. They can't. Thing and place was just a conceptual overload they couldn't get. Now, we didn't like the idea of cut and paste, because when you cut, it's gone, it's disappeared. And it's scary if you've just got this text and then you go someplace else and you select and you paste, well, it comes back, but it was scary. So what we did is, when we went to cut and paste, is we made something called the scrap, which when you cut, it would show that I've got it in this little window here. It hasn't gone away, I just put it in this little holding place. It went through various names, from the scrap to the clipboard to there were various.
I kind of forgot about it until now. But of course, then the early Mac had the scrap book, where you would write sort of the same that come out of that. Maybe because you could cut something and stick it in there so you have it for later and fill a little scrapbook. Yeah. Right. If I remember correctly, it's been a while.
Yeah. And what we didn't have until third parties added was a multiple cut paste, where you could copy, and then paste.
Cut and paste is still a problem.
General Magic solved that by having we had a little valise you could put things into. You drag something in there, and drag something else, and drag something. You could open the valise and drag something out of it. You could see all of the things you had put into this little